Hello, Thrive Nation. We've got a holistic practitioner and naturopathic doctor, yoga teacher. She's a nurse practitioner. She does holistic medicine. It's a privilege to have her on the show. Welcome, Dr. Erica Matluck.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Well, it's so cool to have you on the show. I've been a doctor of Chinese medicine for almost 25 years. So we speak the same language of meridians and chakras and energetic healing. And I want to start with you just setting up what your holistic framework is, because I think that's really important. Then I want to talk about two avatars, maybe a male or a female, where you looked at all these different parts, the mental, emotional, physical, and energetic obstacles to healing. But let's start with a definition of sort of holistic medicine.
Well, thank you for starting by asking me my favorite question, because I think for me, if I think about what my mission is in medicine, it's really getting to people to rethink what this definition of holistic is, as you probably feel too, the wellness industry and integrative medicine work. And there's just so many people use this term holistic. And I think it's really important sometimes that we pause and we define what is the whole and what does it actually mean to be holistic. And so I sort of answer this question in two ways. And the first is that I believe that the definition of the whole is not static, it's dynamic. And this is one of the reasons I love bringing the framework of the chakras into my work, because I could say if I'm standing at the perception of the root chakra, the whole is like the physical body, all the different organ systems of the body, right? And then I could jump up to the sacral chakra and I could say that the whole includes the emotional field. And then I could jump up to the solar plexus and I can say, well, the whole from this viewpoint is the mind, the emotions, and the body, and so on and so forth. But eventually we get to a place where the whole, the boundaries of the whole go beyond the individual self, right? And I get to the heart and it includes my family and my community and the people around me. And then I get to the throat and it includes everywhere my vibration touches, or the vibrations that touch me, sort of like sound waves. And then I get up to the third eye and I think about the whole as inclusive of the quantum field, right? Like past, present, future. And then the crown, it's like there is everything's the whole because it's one. So I think that that's like the first way I answer the question, is just what whole are we talking about? What whole are we working with? And I don't think that one is better than the other, but I do think understanding what the boundaries of the whole for the purpose of whatever work we're doing is important. Most people that come to me, which you can probably relate to, are coming with like some, symptom or some issue, some block, something that they want to experience differently in their health, whether that's in their physical body or their mental health or their life even. And the way I talk about what holistic means in my private practice is that I see each individual as having these four quadrants to themselves: the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And why I think it's really important to point that out is because each one of these quadrants relate to ourselves, reality, others, our lives differently. And so the physical, which most of us in the West are very, very comfortable with, the language is sensation, right? So when we feel a sensation that doesn't feel good, that feels uncomfortable, we turn our attention in and we say, what do I need to do to change what I'm feeling here, right? Maybe it's going to a Chinese medicine practitioner or a doctor or a massage therapist, or, popping an Advil if that's the way you like to handle certain ailments. And similar to the way that the physical quadrant tends to draw us in, I speak the same way about the emotional. So when we have an emotion that doesn't feel good, right? Or even one that feels great, right? We draw our attention in and we say, what do I need to do to either stop this feeling that I don't like, or to create more of this feeling that I do like? And I think about emotional health really as chemistry. It's a molecule binding to a receptor and bringing about a state that we feel. And my 2-year-old son is the best teacher of this, because he feels something really big and then he screams and he has a tantrum, and then he's laughing and he's a completely different state. But where I think oftentimes the conventional medical approach does a disservice with regard to the umbrella of mental health is they sort of merge emotional and mental into the same thing. And I think that those are two very different things, because in my framework, mental health is thoughts and beliefs. And rather than the mental aspect of the self drawing us in, we create from it, we project from it. And so where we get into trouble is if we feel an emotion, an emotional state that should just be a passing wave, right? Like our toddlers teach us. But we have this tendency to jump up into the mind and say, why am I feeling this way? So I scan my life, and you and I both know we can scan our lives, and at any given moment, we can find tons of things that we feel appreciative of and that make us feel happy. But we can also find a lot of problems or things that make us feel angry or sad. And as soon as I put my attention on the thing that I decide rationally explains my emotion, then I create more of that, right? Because then that becomes like the forefront of my life. And so rather than now just feeling this thing, I'm like creating more of it. And I create this feedback loop where with my mind, I'm feeding the thing that is making me feel something that I don't like to feel. So I think it's really important that we understand the difference between those two quadrants in a holistic model. And then, of course, lastly, there's the spiritual quadrant, which, like, I worked in a conventional medical environment for 10 years, and nobody wants to talk about spirituality and medicine, right? So for a long time, I was in an environment where that sort of had to be kept outside of the clinical room. But I think, especially in my work, and you probably see this too, because I think those of us working in these fields, we tend to see a lot of people that aren't well served by the conventional system, people with mystery diagnoses and, really persistent chronic symptoms. And it's like the experience of the dark night of the soul, right? No one can give you the answer. You don't know when you're going to feel better. And I think that that spiritual quadrant of the self can really help us move through those dark times, because it's the mystery, right? And it's like, what do I do? How do I sort of have faith or trust in the process when no one can tell me where it's going? And then energetically speaking, the spiritual quadrant is the quantum field, right? So in the quantum field, all potentials are possible. Every possibility exists, but it's where we put our intention or our attention, really, that makes one possibility more likely than the others. So for me, in a holistic medical practice, really defining what the goals or the intention of the work is really important. So with my patients or clients, that's where we start. It's like, what you define your healing, and what does that look like to you? And then how do we then line up the activities and experiences of the physical, mental, and emotional quadrants to serve that goal?
Oh, powerful,
So
powerful.
yeah, that's kind of how I
Because I think
work with people.
The base of the whole sort of, and it's not a pyramid, because I think that's maybe multiple circles that intersect, and that otherwise it becomes sort of this hierarchical system. But the bigger circle for me is the spiritual, because I think if that's not in place, I don't think the emotional, physical, and mental can have full expression. But we can go on to that. But that's a wonderful framework to look at. And I think sort of spiritual is something that is overlooked and should be more looked at, depending on where the person is spiritually and what their beliefs are. So well done to you. But let's maybe unpack how an emotional obstacle, like dealing with that, give us an avatar of sort of a male or female. You see a lot of patients and clients. You're a naturopathic doctor as well. You obviously do a lot of functional medicine, done the conventional work, but how addressing the emotional aspect or obstacle resulted in an incredible transformation, either mentally or physically.
Yeah, so kind of like an avatar, I'm going to sort of merge a few stories into one. But I'm based in New York City, which, if you don't know, almost everyone in New York City goes to therapy, to talk therapy. It's really, really common. And I'd say the majority of people who come to me have been doing talk therapy for a long, long time. And
Sorry, what do you
what they
define talk therapy? Is that like cognitive behavioral therapy or counseling, or what is talk therapy?
I'd put it all under the same umbrella,
Okay.
right? So cognitive behavioral therapy, psychotherapy, working with some kind of therapist where the main sort of modality is
Mm,
talking about the
okay.
patterns, or talking
Okay.
about, often it's the past. And so a lot of the time people come to me and they understand their why, right? Like they really get it. They're like, this was what happened in my childhood, or this is the environment that I grew up in. And the way that I think about sort of illness and disease and root cause is not like a typical sort of integrative or functional medicine doctor. I don't really think about like your diet is the root cause or your stress is the root cause. I'm looking for an underlying theme that threads its way through all four of those quadrants. So let's just take, for example, the theme of not feeling completely safe in your life, or not feeling safe being who you authentically are. So, for example, let's say I have someone in my office. It's common, and maybe they come to me because they want to work on weight loss. Or maybe they come to me because they have a really dysfunctional relationship with food. They've been, wrapped up in diet culture their whole lives, developed food sensitivities, and they don't know what is safe to eat anymore, right? So they get into these places where they don't feel safe going to a restaurant or eating with certain people, and they don't know, how this meal is going to make them feel. So what I'm looking for, whether it's showing, usually it's showing its face in a lot of different ways, in the physical body, in the mind, thoughts and beliefs, in the emotional field, which is predominantly anxiety in my practice, fear and anxiety. And then, the spiritual, which usually results in how it comes through in our lives, right? Like I've built this entire life in service of being accepted and feeling safe and being validated. But like, I don't really like this life. It doesn't feel like it's my life because I made all of these decisions based on fear and anxiety. And so usually so this is like an example, when I'm working with someone for the first time, I'm doing a really full intake and I'm looking for what is the theme, and how is it showing up in the different areas of self. And so most of my patients or clients, they've worked with a therapist, they've done the mind work, they've said, okay, like, so I don't feel safe, I have a fear of abandonment in relationships, I have a lot of challenging relationships with food, et cetera, et cetera. And they've been talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. And so when they get to me and this like emotional quadrant has never been touched, then I want to look at that. And so what might that look like? Sometimes when someone has done so much work up here, or they have a tendency to come up here, I want to actually stop the talking and get them out of their heads. So I might lead them through some kind of grounding practice, right? Like, let's get into the body. Let's turn the mind off by using the senses, right? Smell, touch, taste, sound, to come into the present moment. And I'm sort of using the body, using sensation to help them connect to feelings. Because for a lot of people, it's hard to just connect with emotion. So a lot of the time I start with sensation and then I bring them into the emotional sphere. And that might look like bringing up memories that elicit certain emotions, and teaching people to sort of cultivate the emotion that they want to feel. It might be finding circumstances in their lives where they feel really safe, right? Like, can we identify one relationship in your life where you feel really safe being the person you are, right? Where you feel unconditionally loved no matter what I do or say, I'm safe, I'm secure. Because the thing is, with this theme, with this sort of wound of feeling unsafe, there was a time in our lives when we were babies and toddlers where, like, if we weren't loved or cared for, or if we were abandoned, it actually did threaten our survival. And the nervous system never really forgets that. So, if we subscribe to the belief that there is a spiritual quadrant of self, which you and I both do, and it's quantum, time is not a thing. So that inner child that still believes that, like, if my partner in my 40s leaves me and I'm abandoned, I feel terrified, because my nervous system is remembering that there was a time when, if love was taken away, my survival was threatened. So I think working with the emotional sphere in this area is very much about, like, just, it's nervous system regulation, right? It's finding peace, it's finding calm, it's finding trust that you're going to be okay. And breathwork practices are a big one that I use for this. And sometimes actually even interspersing long breath holds in a flowing breathwork practice to actually help people meet those feelings of fear and anxiety. Because if you hold your breath at the end of an exhale for long enough, that sort of like primitive fear of death is triggered. And we can work with the emotions in that way, in a way where we actually have control. So
Okay.
this is like sort of I wouldn't say common, like I do this every day, but this is a theme I see often.
And then so what happens?
And
You do the breath work, you do the emotional work, and then the person's relationship to food changes. Or do they breathe, they get a breath work practice, and then all of a sudden they find they make better food choices? Or is that how it works? The manifestation change because you get into the root of the emotional obstacle.
yes, so you get to the root of the emotional obstacle, and then things start to move. And I'm not saying that this is always the way in with everyone. I'm saying that, like, with my typical patient, they've done a lot of the mind work already. And I'd say most often where I see there's been very little work done is in the emotional and spiritual quadrants. So I often see people that are stuck. So it's not like we do the emotional work and then voila, everything changes instantly.
Mm,
But what I find is their relationship to safety changes. They can trust themselves. They can get out of their head and into reality. And then over time, that sort of trickles in to all the different aspects of their life. Because if we can find the root cause, right, like from this perspective, like, what is that theme that's like really fueling imbalance in so many different experiences, then that, and we shift that, that's going to impact everything. So sometimes this isn't like making different food choices, but it's like, oh, I can actually see what I'm eating as nourishment. I can, like, feel safe eating it. And that actually changes the digestive experience, right?
okay.
Because, anyone who understands the nervous system knows that, like, if we eat when we're in fight or flight and we don't feel safe, like, our body is not concerned with, digesting our food and storing nutrients for a later date, right? Our body is like preparing to fight or flight or freeze because we think our survival is threatened. So that, like, finding safety, the impacts of it are vast and wide and can show up in a lot of different areas of life.
Brilliant. So maybe you want to put this sort of emotional intelligence framework of self-awareness of emotion, self-regulation or self-management, then social awareness and relationship management being sort of the four parts of emotional intelligence. I think it's important to give people a little bit of a process. So, because I think I agree with you, emotionally, I think people have the least skills, least awareness, least education, and little attention is given to the emotional sphere or part of this holistic being. And so I think it's crucially important, but people are unaware of this. So put us through a framework of those 4 areas, how you would sort of, teach a patient or educate a patient or, counsel a patient.
Can you say them one more time?
The first one being sort of self-awareness, because a lot of people aren't even aware of the emotion. They're like, oh, they don't even know. They're just like totally like disconnected to the emotional self. Then like regulation, because then they just like, we need to validate our emotions and be aware and witness our emotions, but we need to regulate them as well. Otherwise they manifest in the physical that often shouldn't, because we just sometimes need to be able to be aware of them and sit with them. And then social awareness, what's happening in our community, what's happening with our spouses or our partners or our children, where they at emotionally. And then the last thing is relationship management, our relationship to those different people.
Yeah. And I think when you break it down like that too, you speak to something that's really important, which is like, what are emotional boundaries, right? Because physical boundaries are very clear, right? Like I know if I push you, I'm crossing a boundary when I touch your skin, but no one really talks about emotional boundaries. And the time in our lives when we're really starting to feel emotions and our relationship to emotion is coming online is puberty, right? And we're often not taught what to do with that.
Exactly.
This is an important topic in my practice too, because I work with a lot of empathic people and a lot of practitioners who are feeling other people's stuff. So I love the way that you broke that down. And what I would say is, to some degree, I think how I would approach this with a person depends on their relationship to emotion. I feel like, to speak Chinese medicine terminology, there's a type of person that I work with that where they're like emotionally sort of deficient or numb, and they don't actually know how to engage with emotion or what they're feeling. And then there's like the other side, like there's like sort of the emotional excess, where like I have a lot of people that I work with where they feel things very intensely. And what they have a hard time doing is processing them, because we live in a, culture where it's not acceptable to have like a tantrum on the New York City subway. So I think those 2 different archetypes of people are different. The first one, where people really aren't in touch with what they're feeling, I do what I sort of explained in the last example, where I start with sensation. I use the body first. So I say, let's start by just like naming what you feel sensation wise, temperature, texture, even, whatever, sensory stimuli, what's there. And then from there move into, okay, like what are you feeling right now emotionally? And if it's nothing, then maybe we just give it a name, like numbness. So with this person, I think step 1 is like just identifying what they feel and naming the emotion. Then when it comes to emotional regulation, I think, and I call this, sometimes I do a practice with people called cultivating your emotional field. And I think there's an important educational piece here, especially when we're talking about relationships, that is that your emotions belong to you, and it's chemistry, right? It's like that serotonin molecule binding to a receptor. And I think we have a tendency, especially in the area of relationships, to say like, oh, this person loved me and my heart is broken and I'll, never feel that way again. And what's so unfortunate about that is it's a misunderstanding, because what I felt did not belong to the other person, right? It's my chemistry. So I think that this emotional regulation piece is important in teaching people that, like, ultimately that's you, and you can close your eyes and you can call up a memory or do a visualization, and you can actually, change your serotonin levels or your dopamine levels. And so I think that's a really good tool for people in, like, regulating their emotions. I also think we can do a lot of nervous system work around this, right? Like, how do you get the nervous system, which for so many people is chronically in like a state of fight, flight, freeze, into a more parasympathetic state of, like, I feel calm, I can relax my shoulders. Um, and sometimes in the people that I work with that are, like, disconnected from their emotions, they're also disconnected from what they're doing in their body. And I watch them on our Zoom call and their shoulders are up here, right? And I'm like, well, of course you're feeling anxious, because right now you are literally protecting your carotid artery as if a predator were coming to eat you. And your musculoskeletal system is sending a signal to your brain that says you're not safe, right? So sometimes with these types of people, I help them emotionally regulate through the body. Let's just relax the shoulders. Let's look at where else you hold stress in your body and work in that direction to change the emotional experience. And then, of course, there's in relationship. And I think this is a really important one for everyone, but really for empaths too. This idea of setting emotional boundaries. And one tool I give a lot of my clients is, before you enter a social situation, take stock of what's in your emotional field. How am I feeling right now? Right. And if you're feeling excited and joyful and peace or calm, and then you walk into a party and you immediately feel something different, then you sort of know that, like, you maybe crossed your own boundary, right? You might be feeling something that's someone else's. And I think that in our intimate relationships, we can do that together, and we can work with it in a more ongoing way than in these bigger social settings.
Okay.
But particularly with my empaths in these bigger social settings, right? So the fourth step that you talked about, like raising awareness of, like, especially those of us living in dense urban areas, it's like, if you're a sensitive person and you're in a studio in New York City, you are probably feeling your neighbor's emotions from time to time. And so, I think, one, just acknowledging that and being aware of it is really important. And two, like, some, like, energetic and emotional hygiene, whether it's shaking it off, standing under a shower and, like, letting the water sort of move everything that does not belong to you. Sometimes doing a little meditation or a prayer where you actually give back what does not belong to you to those who you may have picked it up from. I think all of this stuff is really important, and I think it's important that we teach it to children.
Yeah, that is so powerful. Well said, Dr. Erica. Not taking on other people's emotions or over functioning in that area, taking the responsibility and accountability for other people and their emotions. Because, I mean, the fields are so strong. The emotional field is so strong. The heart field has been measured now to extend vastly. The mental field is extending vastly now. So this is very powerful, and people don't think it makes a difference to your health and your well-being, but you can take that on. That can cause issues. So well said there. Do talk about your transformational groups now, because I saw on your website you do a lot of these group work, transformational situations. I think group work is something that is missing in sort of the field of healing and health and wholeness, and how important it is to get together in a group. Even functional medicine docs are now taking like 6 or 8 people who have similar conditions and having a nurse practitioner there or a health coach, because there's power and healing in group work. What is your sort of role there, and how effective has it been?
Yeah, I love group work. And actually, I started doing group work when I worked in a conventional medical environment. And I was working for a primary care group that had offices nationwide. And we were finding there were so many conditions that were lifestyle related. And then, of course, in the American healthcare system, we have so little time with patients. And there was no time to do the educational piece and the lifestyle work. And so I started out my group work by like grouping 15 to 20 patients, mostly with anxiety. I moved on to depression. I moved into some gut health work and insomnia. Those were like the 4 areas that I did group work in the conventional setting. And I found it was really profound. And one of the reasons is because, for better or for worse, the privacy issues in medicine these days, at least in the United States, they make patients feel really alone. So as a provider, I was finding some days I would have the same conversation roughly like 6 or 7 times. And yet each patient felt so alone and sort of like shamed by their anxiety or their digestive issues. And so I found when I got them into groups and they saw, wow, like, not only am I not alone, but like this is actually a cultural systemic issue. This is not something I should be ashamed of because of the choices I'm making. This is like a systemic issue, that has to do with our food production or the food that's available in the city or the way that we work and the stress that comes with commuting 1 hour each day, et cetera, et cetera. So I really fell in love with the therapeutic role of the community. And then I really wanted to take the group work a step farther because I also had this deep knowing that natural light, getting people out of a clinical environment would bring another quality that was missing. And I was very right. In 2017, I did my first retreat, and I was really blown away by the results and like how much could shift in people's lives and bodies in 7 days. And so this is some of what I do these days, once or twice a year, twice a year-ish. I work with my partner on this, who is a very, very talented sound practitioner and mystic and teacher. His name's Paul. We take groups to beautiful places in the world, and we sort of have this holistic experience that is built on the framework, the model that I shared with you. But then each of the days we look through the perceptual lens of one of the chakras. So each day we're looking at a different theme. And what's so fascinating and beautiful to watch is that these themes are universal. So everyone is seeing themselves in the mirror of each other. And 2 things happen. One is each person has profound insights simply because another person is like shining a light in their blind spot. And 2, there's a field that is created, and as someone who understands energy, this when people show up with a shared intention to go on a journey and move blocks and see themselves through new eyes, it's like you have a tailwind in your process and your work. And I do a lot of work in those, and I feel this like added, tailwind, I guess is the best way to describe it, where everything's sort of amplified because the group itself is like another entity.
So powerful.
So Yeah, it's such a beautiful, powerful experience. And then and I do a lot of group work online too.
Mm,
And I'm not sure if you work online, but I
mm,
found when during the pandemic is when I really moved my whole practice online. And at first I was really worried about it. And I thought, I'm like a person who is very energetically sensitive, and I feel like I want to feel what's in the field with my hands.
mm,
And I always felt, and I do still feel like, when you and I are in each other's presence, there's an information exchange that happens between us that we can't
mm,
understand up here, a transmission exchange of sorts. And I was worried like how it was going to impact my work to lose that completely. But I also found working online, when people are in their home environments and relaxed, and you actually start to really attune to facial expressions
mm,
and breath and body language, and the fact that the group itself creates this field, and online those groups are all over the world. And I find that to be very profound, that
sure.
we can sort of create a global grid
Mm,
with our shared intention when we work online together. So
wow.
I think, both of those group experiences have their own
Mm.
gifts to offer.
Sure. And I want to talk because I mean, you're so well informed and well educated, and your knowledge base is so, huge with regards to all alternative complementary therapies and holistic medicine. That in the group, is it about storytelling? And I want to talk about sort of the five ancient healing therapies, and one being sound or music, storytelling. I'm sure you got a view on this because you do these retreats. Another being dance, which I think is important, arts and crafts, doing those, and then food, how important it is to make food together, to sit together and eat. So maybe give us, like, the first thing is about the groups, which is, I think people tell their stories, or you tell a story. And I'm looking at my kids now. I've got a little 7-year-old and a 19-year-old, and storytelling is such a profound way to tell a story, and then to get my daughter to tell her story. So maybe embellish on how important storytelling is, and then we'll move on to sound and music, and then you can give me your views on dance, and then arts and crafts. These are ancient. We've got a lot of ancient ruins in Africa, and just ancient remedies with the African people. And I know it's indigenous people, whether it's in Australia or America, wherever it is, there's these indigenous healing arts, should I say, that are very important. But let's start with storytelling.
I think storytelling is really important, and why I love it in a group. I mean, I love it one-on-one too, but what I think is so fascinating about storytelling and where it really comes into play, at least in my work, is it's sort of like when someone tells their story, I'm listening to the story, but I'm also reading between the lines, right? So it's like how they tell the story
Mm,
is what's so important to me, because what I typically find with most people I work with, whether it's on
mm,
retreat or one-on-one, is that there's judgment in the story, right? There's like, you can feel whether it's cultural conditioning or, family values or societal ideas about what is
mm,
good and bad and right and wrong. And I like looking for those things in a story, because that's usually where the healing is. And I think I don't do this on my retreat, but I think it would be really interesting to start a transformational experience by inviting everyone to tell their story, and then ending by letting them tell the same story and see how it's changed. The other thing that comes up when in my own, where like storytelling lives in my work, is this idea of archetype, which I think is really, really important, and symbol. as it comes through ourselves, because this is also one of the things that connects us. And especially in this day and age of, everyone knows their astrological sign and their human design type, and people are pulling cards from their tarot deck. And we have this tendency sometimes to limit ourselves to one archetype. And sometimes when we tell our story, you can find what that archetype is. And one of the things I want to do in my work is like really empower people to remember that we all have all the archetypes within us, right? I'm not just the, female healer, or the warrior, or the mother, or whatever it is, right? I'm all the things. So when we choose what story we want to tell, it's like the same thing as when someone fills out their dating profile, right? There are 1,000 different things you could share about yourself, but you chose this one. So what is it about that archetype? Is it that you're stuck in that archetype and you want to actually branch out? Or is it that that's like the archetype that you admire and want to embody more in your life? So I think that's an interesting thing to look at. And one of the things we do on our retreat, which is a little bit of like a giveaway, because it's a surprise when you arrive, is that each day we pull a card from a tarot deck. And at the end of the retreat, each person has the opportunity to basically tell the story of the retreat through the cards. And it's always such a profound moment, watching people interpret the different symbols that came up.
Sure. Okay, great. Let's move on to sound and music then. I mean, obviously your spouse being there. How important is music from a healing perspective, especially the emotional field, and sound therapy?
I mean, I think it's so important. And I almost I laugh at myself answering this question, because my partner is so masterful that I'm like the student and he is the teacher in this domain. But what he would say, to channel him here, is that what music brings in is this idea of ethos. And he will usually take people through a little exercise where he'll play a chime, will ask you what emotion it elicits, and then a very similar chime with a slightly different tone. And you see how one is wonder and the safety of being a baby, and another one is sort of like this eerie, introspective emotion that comes up. And and then you start to sort of extract that into the playlist I listen to when I exercise is so different than the playlist I listen to if I'm feeling sad, or my heart is broken, or I want to sort of wallow in those feelings. And you start to realize or even just watching films and seeing how much the music moves you. And I think when people understand that, and it's one of the reasons I love working with Paul, and everyone who comes on our retreats or has worked with him is just how do you always know what to play? But we'll be in these sort of deep holotropic states, and he'll play a song that will bring up all the memories that someone needs to see in that moment to heal something. And it just is, it's so profound. And just like you said, the ancients knew this, so I always sort of laugh at myself when I look at how simple this is. It's vibration.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I
it's
think
all
of
sound.
one of my greatest areas is we go around a fire. There's a drum beat, like an African drum beat, someone on guitar. We get to share a bit of our lives, and then there's this music. And I don't know, I come away from those times, and sometimes it's just men retreats and men moments or men evenings with this fire, this music. It does something to my soul. I can't even actually articulate it, but it does something deep inside of me, which is, I don't know, I think is so profound and should be used more.
I totally agree. Totally agree.
Cool. I know we're coming to the end of the show and we've got quite a few of these other ancient, but maybe talk about dance and then we can wrap up the show. I'd love to have you back on. I think you're very fascinating and interesting. You're looking at a different angle of healing and holistic medicine that I think is really lacking. But let's talk about dance. What are your views on dance with regards to healing, and how important has that been to some of your patients and clients over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, I think movement is really important. I want to put dance in a category of movement. And I think that what's important to me is that when you change your physical form, you change your state of consciousness, right? And so my background is more yogic, where it's like, we're putting the body into these specific shapes to change the way that energy moves, which, I mean, we could probably geek out on this, but I actually think if someone really sat down with the knowledge of Chinese medicine and nadis and meridians and yogic sciences, that we would find that there's a lot of similar threads in terms of, you do this pose and it impacts this meridian. And these aren't my areas of expertise, so I don't know all that, but I know deep in my heart that that is true. And so I think that movement, I'm a big proponent of balance in the process. And so I think that we need a balance of structure and flow. And sometimes a yoga practice where we're saying, this is what the shape should look like, and cueing people to move into a specific position, I think there's a place for that. It's very structured and it plays a really big role in our retreat and the journey that we take people on. And then I also think it needs to be balanced with freedom of movement, right? Where we're actually listening to the call within of what way does my body want to move? And I would put dance in that category, right? Because dance, unless it's some choreographed practice, dance is more free flowing. And so we don't do a ton of that on our retreat. We don't do a ton of dance, although we do bring in the principle where there's freedom of movement. And I guess you could call this dance, where there's unstructured movement opportunities where we're saying, let the movement move you from within. And I think that's very important because it's another form of storytelling, really. As practitioners, we could probably sit in silence with someone and watch the way that they hold their body and move their body and actually know quite a bit about them. And so if you then take that a little farther, and just like a physical therapist or a rolfer sometimes will watch someone's gait for a really long time to determine a lot of information about, leg length and hip rotation and all this stuff. I think that there are a lot of skilled practitioners that could watch someone dance and know a lot about their history and what they're holding in their body.
Well said, Dr. Erica. Last question before we wrap up, and thank you once again just for your courage and your calling, just your articulation and communication and your heart to see people transformed. Is been in practice now 25 years at the end of this year, and very grateful, never missed a day's work to sickness or ill health due to just my life and how much I love my work and love my calling. But I find more and more people are getting sick, coming to see me, and they put in all these changes, and 6 months later they're so much happier and healthier. But I find a year later or 18 months later or 2 years later, they've gone back to their old ways, their old eating habits, or dysfunctional emotional manifestations, really struggling to sustain their transformation. What are your keys or your strategies or your tools to help people sustain their transformation?
I think that's such a good point and question. I really do think it's the hardest part of the whole thing, right? Because a lot of the time patients come to us and they've been in these patterns for 20, 30 years. And then you work for 6 months and you see change, but like a lot of the old structures are still there. And so I say two things for this. One is, I really do think that when we work holistically, when we engage all four quadrants of the self, the healing or the transformation is way more sustainable than when we're just looking at, one or two or even three quadrants. So that's my one thing, is like, if someone, slips out or falls back, it's like, is there a quadrant that we missed? Is there a quadrant that we didn't get deep enough into? And let's take a look at that. The other thing is this, that like, and you and I both know this, like healing is not linear. And if you take 20 steps forward and then you take 10 steps back a year later, that doesn't mean that your work is not working. It doesn't mean that it failed, right? And a lot of the time, I feel like I see this a lot where people say, I do all this work, I did all this work, and now like I feel like I'm right back where I started. But you're never back where you started, because change is a constant. And sometimes these moments where we've slipped back, they're really important moments to reflect on our work and to say, okay, I'm in this again, but let me identify what's different. I'm aware of it. Maybe those sugar cravings aren't as severe as they used to be. And I think that this is really important, because I think we live in a culture at a time where like the wellness industry would make anyone into, a self-help junkie, right? Like, and there's often this, focus on what I need to fix, what I need to work on, what I need to do better, right? We're very self-critical. And so if we never stop, and I used to say this in working in conventional medicine all the time, where it's like people only come into the office when health is a problem. And mental quadrant here, if we only look at our health when it's a problem, our health is going to be a problem, right?
Exactly.
Like it's not. Right. So I think sometimes in these moments where we're like, okay, we've fallen back into these old patterns, rather than looking at it as, uh-oh, what do I need to fix again to get back on track? Let me look at what's different this time. Let me acknowledge myself for the work that I've done and find the steps I've taken forward, and like relish in that and be in that for a little while before I start taking steps again in that direction of fixing myself.
Brilliant. Celebrate the micro wins, celebrate the journey, celebrate the pathway. Well said. Thank you so much, Dr. Erica. Where can people find and connect with you?
They can find me on Instagram. The handle is at experience7senses, all written out. And then the website is the same, experience7senses.com.
Well, thank you. I declare favor and blessing over you. Thank you for your calling. Thank you for your courage, who you are. I just really declare just that you would grow and immensely influence so many people, because you have a heart to transform so many people worldwide. So thank you so much. Look forward to connecting again, and hope our paths cross one day, possibly in New York City or in Africa.
Thank you so much. I hope that too. I haven't been to South Africa.